China took advantage of the World Trade Organization to increase its trade in the United States fivefold. It accumulated $4 trillion in currency reserves, and it used these reserves to do two things: modernize its military, to challenge the United States, become the workshop of the world, and take $1 trillion from that $4 trillion reserve and launch something called the Belt and Road Initiative, which is laying down an infrastructure of roads, rails, and pipelines, energy and industry that is unifying what have historically been two continents, Europe and Asia, into a single continent, a unitary market stretching from the Atlantic all the way to the Pacific.
It is my pleasure to welcome Alfred W. McCoy to the show. He is a Harrington Chair in History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's written about 25 books, very prolific, his latest being To Govern the Globe, World Orders and Catastrophic Change. And we're going to dive into several topics today. Al, welcome to the show. How are you?
Oh, great. And yourself?
It's good to have you. Yes, doing very well. Really looking forward to learning more about To Govern the Globe. And just if you want to start off, just give us kind of the general thesis of the book, and let's go from there.
Sure. The book sweeps through 600 years of history, arguing that in those 600 years, there have been 90 empires, large and small, but there have been just 3 world orders. So in effect, global power has, for the last 500 years, had 2 manifestations: power, that's to say empires, and principle enshrined in world orders. And the U.S. world order combines this duality. One, the principles were established and enshrined at the United Nations when it was established in 1945, and also in the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and that was founded on 2 principles. 1, that every human being had immutable human rights, and 2, every human community should be freed from colonialism and imperialism and have the right to live in their own sovereign nation, which would have inviolable sovereignty. And undergirding these 2 principles was an international rule of law, and infusing the entire apparatus was a spirit of cooperation. So for the past 70 years, we lived in a world that's been embodied this duality. 1, the principles enshrined in the UN that have created a really vital and viable international community, and 2, enormous U.S. hegemonic power. We are the most powerful empire the world has ever seen. And yet, like all power, it has its due-by date, and ours is coming due in 2030. And when U.S. global power comes to an end in roughly 2030, or begins to wane markedly by that date and give way to China, the critical question we're facing is, will this liberal international order that the United States created during its 70 years as the globe's great hegemon, will that survive? And right now, I'm rather pessimistic about that possibility.
And so that's really about the rise of China displacing the U.S. as the hegemon. So why will that happen? Is it just because of China's economic growth? Is it the dollar losing its reserve currency status? What is your thesis for that? Because my concern, well, not really concern about China, but I guess the reason I'm less concerned about China, maybe is the better way to say it, is that, China has a pretty significant demographic problem that's going to really start to show up in about 10 to 15 years due to their one-child policy, obviously. But what are your thoughts on that?
Sure. First of all, you asked, why is China's rise and America's decline? As I like to put it, America's decline has been something of a bipartisan project in Washington, D.C. The United States political elite has made some absolutely disastrous decisions that have preordained our global power to eclipse. First, in 2001, when we were at the peak of our global power, we had won the Cold War. We were the world's unchallenged superpower. There was no peer rival with U.S. on the planet. And at this moment of arrogance, imperial hubris, Republican and Democratic elites decided that we could admit China as an economic equal to the World Trade Organization, and we were so powerful. It was the end of history. All of humankind, and for all times, would succumb to American principles of democracy and capitalism. And the world would be swept down this path that a supremely powerful America would create. There was no recognition of what would happen when the world's most powerful civilization, which until the 18th century, for over 1,000 years, arguably 2,000 years, had been the most powerful nation on the planet and home to 20% of the world's population. What would happen when this entity joined the World Trade Organization and was given full membership in the international community? Well, Washington elites assumed that they just play by our rules. Well, of course, it's China, and they have their own rules. Right. And they have their own sense of destiny, and they have not been a part of the dialogue, the painful dialogue over the last 500 years that produced the human rights that's enshrined in the UN. They don't have much respect for human rights, frankly.
Yep.
Okay, so China took advantage of the World Trade Organization to increase its trade in the United States fivefold. It accumulated $4 trillion in currency reserves, and it used these reserves to do two things: modernize its military, to challenge the United States, become the workshop of the world, and take $1 trillion from that $4 trillion reserve and launch something called the Belt and Road Initiative, which is laying down an infrastructure of roads, rails, and pipelines, energy and industry that is unifying what have historically been two continents, Europe and Asia, into a single continent, a unitary market stretching from the Atlantic all the way to the Pacific. And one thing that Washington once knew at the start of the Cold War, but has since forgotten, is that in this succession of empires that have been the global hegemon over the last 500 years, starting with Portugal and Spain, moving to Holland, Britain, the United States, and China, this amazing diversity of imperial powers has always done one thing. In order to become the global hegemon, you must dominate Eurasia. Today, it's home to roughly 70% of the world's population and productivity. And during the Cold War, the United States controlled both axial ends of Eurasia through the NATO alliance in Europe, through 4 mutual defense pacts with Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and Australia. And through these two axial ends, we united them, we linked them with bands of steel, naval armadas, air bases, mutual defense pacts, and we dominated Eurasia. We confined China and Russia behind the Iron Curtain. And now China is using the Belt and Road Initiative to break our economic dominance over Eurasia. And if that happens, then it's almost as if by natural law, power and profit will flow to Beijing, and they will become the epicenter of the global economy. And PricewaterhouseCoopers, the global accounting firm, estimates that by 2030, China's economy will be 50% larger than the U.S. economy. The U.S. National Intelligence Council predicted back in 2012 that by 2030, China's economy would be larger than America's. And since both Beijing and Washington spend roughly 2 and 3% of their gross domestic product over the long term on defense, when your economy is 50% bigger, your military will grow correspondingly larger. China is already a peer competitor with the U.S. military. They have an advantage over the United States military in areas like security of satellite communications, missile defenses, and they're making breakthroughs in hypersonic missiles that fly so fast that they can punch holes in any U.S. defense system that we have to protect the United States.
Yeah.
Okay,
so I want to go back to why the elites sold America out. And I remember Clinton and Bush arguing for the entry into the WTO. You know, as you're speaking, I can just sort of remember those speeches, right? And in my head. And it seems to me that, you know, maybe one of the primary motivators is the instant gratification of easing inflationary pressure that I think was really building up in the economy very significantly. And if not for China providing these cheap consumer goods and cheap labor coming across the southern border from Mexico, I think inflation would have been significantly worse. In fact, and you know, this is just my own thought, maybe it's a crazy theory, but I've always thought this. I think after Nixon took us off the gold standard in 1971, that was a big part of his reason for that historic trip to China. He saw that as a cheap labor pool. Maybe he was just an incredible visionary back in the day. And then, 7 years later, China starts really opening up and becoming partially capitalistic, right? So what do you think of that? Are those outlandish conspiracy theories, or do they make sense?
No, but if you look at the three individuals involved, okay, Richard Nixon, George W. Bush, and Hillary Clinton,
Yep.
they know many things, but there's one thing you can be pretty sure they know nothing about whatsoever is economics.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? I mean, they're all three of them are functionally economic illiterates. Okay, so that's not part of their toolkit. They're thinking in terms of geopolitical power. They're thinking in terms of U.S. power. And the decision back in 2001 to admit China to the World Trade Organization was taken at a time when it's difficult to recover the enormous arrogance of the American political elite. We had won the Cold War.
Yeah.
We were the most powerful nation on the planet. We were the most powerful empire that had ever happened. Okay. And we used the 10 years following the end of the Cold War to remake the world in our image. There was a powerful 1-2 punch with the US economy and the international organizations like the IMF going around the world and busting down every trade barrier, every form of protection, every nationalist entrepreneur, wiping away all that and creating free markets. And then you got to remember, we laid hundreds of thousands of miles of fiber optic cables around the planet. And so by the end of that decade of the 1990s, America had built its great globalized economy that it wanted. And it thought that it could bring China into this enormously powerful apparatus and China would be remade. Okay. The other major decision, and this was more on the neoconservative side of the political equation, was at the same time China was hindering the World Trade Organization. That was, of course, 2001. That was 9/11, the 9/11 attacks, and the global war on terror. And the United States spent the next 20 years and about $8 trillion deciding to invade the Middle East and to build the Green Zone in Baghdad and to make that the base for the U.S. insertion and transformation of the Middle East. We're going to transform Arabic culture, the cradle of civilization, the oldest cultures on the planet. We were going to transform them by our power and presence, right? If there was any economic logic to that, it was securing a permanent lien on the region's oil. Well, think about it strategically. We invested $8 trillion in securing a permanent lien on oil at about the time it was joining cordwood and coal in the dustbin of history. I mean, it was a terrible strategic decision.
Meaning that oil was lessening in importance? Is that what you're saying?
Coal is gone. I mean, are you recommending to your investors they buy coal shares?
Well, no.
Coal is going, and petroleum is going to be fast. It's going to go fast. By the time the world's automobile fleet converts, and it will convert, regardless of what the nations will, by 2035, you will not be able to buy a petrol-driven motor vehicle on the planet. It'll be gone.
The only proviso that I want to throw in there, though, is that in the U.S., what is it, about 50% now, give or take, of that energy is from coal. So,
So we have to convert the grid as well. We have
Right.
two tasks ahead for climate change. One is to convert the grid to renewable resources, and two, to convert our transport fleet, which is road and rail and air. Air is going to be the most difficult one, right?
Sure.
To renewable energy. And by the way, there is one ready resource that we have that needs to come back into this package and nuclear power.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I'm a big fan of nuclear.
France generates 70%
I know.
of electricity from nuclear power, no accidents, absolutely secure.
One of the best things France has done in the last 150 years is nuke itself, to provide nuclear power. It's been a stunning success there. And it's pollution free virtually. I couldn't agree more. But, you get these half-baked ideas that came from the 70s environmental movement, Jane Fonda and the China Syndrome movie, and everybody just freaked out about nuclear power. And then 3 Mile Island happened. And, anyway, it is what it is.
But the other thing that's going to change with nuclear power is that we're going to have micro nuclear generators.
Right. On the backs of pickup trucks. Yeah.
Well, the advantage is, one, they can be assembled in factory under factory conditions. Okay. And as with any product, the longer engineers manufacture, they work out all the bugs and it becomes close to 100% reliable. Second, with a small nuclear reactor, if there is an accident, you don't have a 3 Mile Island or a Chernobyl.
Right.
You've got a much more manageable eruption, which you can readily contain. Okay, so we're gonna see micro nuclear reactors supplementing the variables of wind and solar, and we will convert the nation's grid. It's going to happen.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah, and we're probably going to see container ships eventually on nuclear power as well. The problem with that is defending that reactor, right? On a military ship, you can defend the reactor with the guns on the ship, right? But on a commercial ship, if it's not armed, that reactor could be the real thing that pirates would be after, right? And terrorists would be after. So anyway, but that's go ahead and comment on it. We're kind of going on a tangent here, but I just wanted to understand, is that the reason you're saying the Middle East thing turned out to be such a misguided policy because oil was lessening in importance? That's where I really was getting. Yeah,
exactly. Okay. So, and that of course raises the issue of climate change. Now, I said that around 2030, it's likely that China will replace the United States as the world's dominant economic power, at least a peer military power, if not slightly superior in a number of critical areas, and maybe even supplant the US world order with a very different kind of Chinese-led world order, okay? So if China becomes the world's global hegemon around 2030, this is something else I did in the book, To Govern the Globe, was what I did is I took environmental science, which is distinct among all of the major sciences, okay? If you think about economics, they'll maybe predict the next recession. Politicians will maybe say something about the next election. But most social scientists and many natural scientists are loath to predict. Environmental science, by contrast, is all about prediction. When you read the articles in the journals, they have trajectories that go right to the end of the century. And they have high, medium, and low probability, but it's all very scientific, very well calculated. So what I did in the book was I overlaid those projections about the course of climate change with likely political changes. And what I came to the conclusion is that although China may become the world's great global hegemon around 2030, that its time as the dominant world power is not going to last more than about 20 years because of climate change. China is among the world's major industrial powers going to be the most adversely affected by climate change. The science is very clear. By 2050, which is only 30 years from now, Shanghai is basically going to be underwater. Shanghai was dredged from sea and swamp in the 15th century, and to water it will return. All right. The other thing that's going to happen is that it's not just global warming, it's actually global heating. And as the world heats, the North China Plain, which is between Shanghai and Beijing and is currently home to 400 million people, and is in many ways the agricultural and industrial heartland of China, that will become by 2060 or 2070 one of the least habitable places on the planet. They're going to have hundreds of extreme weather events. And then beginning in those middle decades of this century, it's estimated they're going to have 5 events at least of what's called 35-degree centigrade wet bulb temperature. Now, what's that? That's when the balance of heat and humidity is such that the human body cannot sweat. And an adult, a healthy adult, seated in 35-degree wet bulb temperature is dead in 6 hours.
Wow. Okay. Well, I remember being in Bucharest, Romania, when it was close to 40 degrees Celsius, and it was incredibly uncomfortable, especially with the way that urban environment with all the concrete just absorbs the heat and doesn't let it go. It just never cools. So yeah, I couldn't agree more. And not to mention China has a huge dam problem potentially as well, but they also have a population problem where their population is going to become really top heavy. And I kind of think they think that they will automate their way out of that problem with robotics, but we'll see.
The other thing they can do is simply extend their age of retirement, as we're doing in this society.
Yeah.
I mean, we have, our president in his late 70s. We have Supreme Court justices in their 80s. Those are demanding jobs. Workers should simply start working longer. China retires very young by international right. That's going to stop because that's a legacy of their agricultural past. Because when you're doing hard physical labor, by 60 you're shot. Okay, I mean you're exhausted. Your body is tired. But when you're doing
Yeah.
and intellectual work, you can go on
Right. For a long time.
to your 80s. You can add another 20 years to working life. So I think the demographic issue is less problematic than most people assume.
Okay, that's fair. So tell us how, with this scary idea of 2030, only 8 years away, China becoming the global power, displacing the United States. The US is number two, China's number one, Japan will be number three probably, but there are huge, bigger demographic problems, of course. But anyway, it's 2030. China is the world leading power. How does that look? What does China do? How do they throw their weight around the world? What does it mean to Americans and the rest of the world?
Sure. First of all, in the evolution of the current world order, it's not just that the US created. This is the culmination of 5 years of debate and development. Okay. Once the Vatican lost its role as the diplomatic mediator of Europe in roughly the 17th century, the Europeans began developing international law and were the successor to that. When the United States entered the international arena in the 1890s at the first International Hague Peace Conference and at the second Hague Peace Conference in 2007, one of the United States stood for consistently was establishing the institutions for the international rule of law. Okay. And then as a part of this 5th-century debate, there was the development of a doctrine of human rights. Initially, the idea was that slavery was inhumane, but then under the British, although the British devoted themselves to abolishing slavery, they justified colonialism, which stripped the colonial subjects of their civil rights and required them to do unpaid labor for up to 2 months a year. Okay, all of that came to an end in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 before the United Nations. Okay, so there is these 5 centuries of development of this tradition of human rights that is going to end because China did not participate in those debates. They have very different values, different kind of political culture that, as the oldest civilization on the planet, by far, developed continuously. So we're going to see an end to an enshrinement of human rights as an immutable international principle. We are going to see an end to the idea of the spirit of cooperation and the rule of law. The Chinese, as a command society, do not have an elite to go to law school like most of the American or European political elite. If you look at them, they're all our legislators, all our national leaders are disproportionately lawyers. Okay, there's a fabric of legality that's woven through our culture that doesn't exist in a command communist society like China. So the rule of law is going to be subordinated, and we saw that when China lost that case over the Spratly Islands with the Philippines in front of the Permanent Court of Arbitration at The Hague. China just dismissed the decision and the whole fabric of international law out of hand, just waved it away. Okay, yeah. So we're going to see
no respect for international law, huh?
Yeah. No cognizance of it. China will observe it as it suits its convenience, but otherwise, it's not an ingrained value in that society. It's a party-led society, not a rules and law-based society. The second thing that's likely to happen is that relations among nations are going to become what I call, kind of cash and carry internationalism, mutually advantageous, transactional relations. Okay, and China will not hold nations to standards of probity, anti-corruption, respect for human rights, gay rights, women's rights, all that. That'll go by the board.
Yep.
So that commercial agreements will be just that, purely commercial agreements. On the positive side, however, that although the United States and our international order lifted over half of humanity from the most extreme poverty, which is living on $1 a day,
right,
there are hundreds of millions of people that are living in poverty, which is defined as less than $5 a day. And when the Cold War was over, with that neoliberal model that the U.S. introduced around the world, which was basically free market economics and minimum state intervention, those hundreds of millions were essentially forgotten. Well, China's Belt and Road Initiative, pumping $1 trillion into Eurasia, another $1 trillion into Africa, is in fact providing livelihood and access to employment and infrastructure for vast swaths of the planet that the neoliberal economic order, with its profit orientation, had simply forgotten about. So China does have a certain mission. Xi Jinping, whenever he speaks, He talks about the 60 million Chinese that they have recently lifted out of poverty, for moving them from impoverished villages to more prosperous cities. And they say that their Belt and Road Initiative will do the same for the rest of the world. And there's something serious there. So it's not all dark. You know?
Yeah. I'm curious. China is very paying a lot of attention to Africa. And I have two questions about that. Number one, do you think China is looking at Africa as the next workshop of the world to replace themselves as their people move up the socioeconomic ladder? And number two, do you think it is using its African initiatives as a debt trap? You know, the way some people accuse other entities and countries of doing. But do you think China's doing that, or it's really just good joint ventures and world development, or is it meant to be a debt trap? I mean, nobody knows their true intentions, of course, except them, but just curious what your take would be.
Sure. Let's put this in context. Beginning with the Berlin Conference of 1885, in which the European powers agreed to carve up Africa and started the scramble for Africa, in which the entire continent went from a few tiny colonial enclaves on the coast, literally, in 1878, 1880, to within 20 years, universal colonialism. And the European record in Africa was, I mean, shameful. You know, the greatest scandal of the age was the Congo Free State on King Leopold, under King Leopold of the Belgians, and roughly 10 million people died under that brutal labor mobilization regime they ran. The combination of the brutal wars of conquest, the imposition of unpaid coerced labor of 60 days a year in the Portuguese and the Belgian colonies, it was in the Belgian Congo right up until the end of World War II. In the labor code, whipping was a permissible form of industrial discipline. Okay, I mean, this is a sordid record, beyond imagining. Okay, and that's, if you compare colonialism, what it did in, let's say, Asia with Africa. Asia was not utopia, but nothing like Africa. Okay, so and then when the Cold War came, it became a convenient battleground for the United States. I mean, during the years of the Cold War, we were allied with the apartheid government in South Africa out of political convenience. Okay, so when we were playing Cold War games and we pumped billions of dollars into Angola that sustained a brutal civil war for 20 years, that sowed the country with landmines and killed countless tens of thousands of people. Yeah. What was China doing? China was launching its first serious international aid effort and built the Tanzan Railroad from Tanzania to Zambia to free Zambia from having to ship their copper to international ports through apartheid South Africa. And so China has had, really for the last 45 years, sustained serious economic engagement with Africa. We regard Africa in an institution like the Gates Foundation as kind of a charity case.
Right.
You know, give them a little bit of venture capital to be nice, and send them some mosquito nets and some vaccines when we, have a little bit left over, right? China takes Africa very seriously. Mm-hmm. They're investing $1 trillion. They're laying down infrastructure. Lagos is going to have a modern road transport system thanks to China. Mm-hmm. Kenya is going to have a modern national railroad system thanks to China. Well, I could go on and on.
But there's been a lot of criticism about all those projects in China or in Africa, with China funding them and partnering on them, saying that they sound good on paper, but they just don't work out. They build things in places where there's really just not high demand or usefulness. Of course, there's always critics. I understand that. I just wanted to get your thoughts on it.
There was a study done at Johns Hopkins where they reviewed 1,000 of these Chinese contracts, and they reviewed them for basically this debt colonialism charge. And they said that no, the contracts are reasonably sound, reasonably well administered. But look, when you're going to throw essentially $2 trillion around the globe, and you're going to set aside the World Bank and the IMF and the international standards for fiscal probity, you're going to make loans to governments that have limited capacity and entrenched corruption. There will be some money lost at the margins. Okay, there's no question.
Sure.
I think the Western press plays up the excesses, okay, and minimizes, the the real gains, the serious projects. You know, the stories in the Western press. I mean, how many stories have we seen about the opening of a railroad, about the construction of a new highway, about, you know, people getting jobs in mines and plants? You know, it's not covered in our press.
Right.
You know, it's all negative. Okay.
Yep.
Okay. So, I mean, it's skewed coverage. I understand why that happens, but it's
Sure.
skewed.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, no, you have a real balanced view. I mean, you're critical of China and then you're positive about them in other ways. So it makes sense. Okay, well, wrap it up for us in, just anything else on what that world of 2030 looks like. I think, something that is disconcerting for sure. Reserve currency. What about the economic side of it? Will the dollar still have hegemony even after this new world order of China leading the world, or is the dollar completely displaced by that time?
And that's difficult to predict. It's already started to happen. The yuan is now part of the basket of currencies.
Yep.
I expect its share to grow, and I expect the dollar will become just one of a number of currencies. Also, our fiscal management is not particularly sound. We had that massive giveaway tax cut under Trump, and we're gonna write some checks against the future under Biden. We've already written $2 trillion in checks against the future under Biden, and we just passed this massive defense budget that's ever growing. So, look, the way I put it, and I did this in my last book, In the Shadows of the American Century, I called this the Grand Imperial Bargain. Okay. One of the things that when the U.S. set up the world order in the 1940s, they established the UN in 1945, but 2 years before, the 50 nations of the world met at Bretton Woods and they set up the international system in which they agreed that the dollar would serve formally as the world's global reserve currency with a fixed convertibility to gold, right? And okay, so that has been the Grand Imperial Bargain. Give us your oil, give us your Mercedes Benzes, give us your machine tools, and we will give you brightly colored pieces of paper.
And it's amazing that worked after 1971. I'm amazed that the world kept doing that deal.
They didn't have a choice. They didn't have a choice. And they've been doing it for the last 50 years. And so it's been this bargain. And we have built our entire social contract of weak social safety net and miserable workers' wages. $7 an hour? $7 an hour? Where in this country can anybody live on $7 an hour as a minimum wage? And the way that's viable is because we have the cheapest goods in the United States. Well, when that global reserve currency diminishes and we actually start having to pay real world market prices for our goods and services that our workers use, that social contract is going to start to unravel, and there are going to be real tensions in the United States. But what I see as a more serious long-term problem beyond 2030 is looking forward a bit more into the future, 2050, which is not that far away, really. It's only 30 years. It's a generation away. And what I see is by then, climate change is going to produce very serious problems for the world order. It's now estimated by the World Bank and the UN and other organizations that by 2050, there are going to be 200 million climate change refugees, conservatively estimated, and as many as 1.2 billion climate change refugees. People, not refugees of choice, migrants of choice, but people fleeing eroding seashores and floodplains and desert fringes that are aridifying. And the world is going to be in motion. And let's just imagine what that's going to do to the world order. Okay, let's think back very quickly, 2016, 2018, right? We saw this surge of anti-immigrant global populism because of the arrival of Middle Easterners on the borders of the European Union, Africans crossing the Mediterranean, and Central Americans coming to the United States. When you add up all those people who migrated during that 2 and 3 year period, it's only 2 million people. How is the world going to cope with 200 million to 1 billion refugees? The world order is going to collapse into disorder unless there is a change and the emergence through very modest reforms at the UN or some successful organization. 3 reforms. 1, if a nation by 2050 is still emitting greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, they will face sanctions as severe as, let's say, crossing a border with troops today.
Well, okay. If China's running the world, it's not going to place those sanctions on itself, that's for sure.
No power does, but that's what you need a more empowered international community to do. Second, that the UN High Commission of Refugees or some like organization will simply make refugee resettlement no longer voluntary, but mandatory, regarding the planet as a lifeboat in which drowning people have to be accommodated. And third, something that was discussed at Glasgow, there's supposed to be a transfer of $100 billion voluntarily from the rich industrial nations to the poor tropical nations that are suffering the greatest adversity of climate change. That voluntary transfer, which has been very partial at best, must become mandatory so that people living in tropical and arid regions that are impacted by climate change can maximize their safety and security and can shelter in place instead of being forced to migrate. And those three changes will produce, although they're small, they will produce an empowered global order of the kind that we haven't seen in this succession of global orders over the last 500 years. But without those changes to create a new kind of empowered global order, the world will collapse into global disorder with profound consequences, water wars, primal struggles over land and shelter and food. The planet will erupt in petty localized violence of a kind that we have never seen. And that
okay, so to be fair, to balance this dystopian image, which is really terrible, obviously, there always seems to be some technology or series of technologies that save us from these types of things. I mean, you go back to Malthus and look at what he was saying a long time ago, right? And there have been no shortage of these types of predictions. Isn't that a possibility?
We're beyond predictions. The prediction was actually first made 1896 at the height of the industrial age. Svante Arrhenius, a Nobel Prize-winning Swedish physicist, published an article and said that the CO2 accumulating in the atmosphere is going to raise the temperature of the Arctic by 9 degrees centigrade. No, that was 1896. So we've had predictions, okay? And those predictions went on for 100 years. We now have unimpeachable evidence of climate change, human-caused climate change. It's beyond
but it's not only, assuming that's all true and fine, that's obviously, a lot of people debate this stuff, but we don't need to. But, there could be some technology that saves us from the catastrophic element of it, and maybe it doesn't actually change the climate. It just, mitigates the disaster, right? So there are lots of possibilities like that, things we can't even imagine. I mean, humans are pretty resourceful. We make a mess, but we tend to figure a way out of it usually.
Well, we do have the way out. The way out is transforming our energy infrastructure to renewable energy. Okay, but even if we do that within the time frame that we've given ourselves by 2050, and by the way, China has said 2060, and India said 2070. By 2070, the research says that the Gangetic Plain will be second to the North China Plain for the number of 35-degree wet bulb temperature incidents. So, I mean,
there are groups of scientists that literally say we will be in an ice age by 2030, right? You've seen those articles. So, But
the consensus of environmental science, which is pretty soundly done, and what we can see in front of our face, the California wildfires, the Australian wildfires, the collapse of the permafrost and tundra in the Arctic, the Thwaites Glacier calving into the sea. I mean, these are, in these scientific projections, they always do, a kind of most extreme kind of disaster, which is the least probable. Well, if you look at the evidence, it seems that the modest anticipation of the impact of climate change is already been superseded. We're
Sure.
no longer in the modest range.
But all of those forecasts are based on existing technologies and not some new technology that we can't imagine that might help us solve the problem or cope with it. Do you think we're in for climate lockdowns where, like with COVID, the government locks people down because they don't want them to go and pollute and change the climate?
No, that's not going to happen because we still have to maintain an economy.
Yeah.
Without a vital economy producing the profit and the resources, that we wouldn't be able to transform the infrastructure. We're faced with one of the greatest transformations of the world economy, since the introduction of coal-fired steam engines, in the early 19th century. Mm-hmm. We've got to convert the world's grid to renewable energy. That's going to require hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars in capital, a massive investment in technology, massive investment in resources.
Right.
mean, we can't be locking down at the same time we're transforming.
Well, I agree, but they certainly locked down the economy for COVID. So, that just seems like it's now on the table, right? So,
Don't think so, but that's just my view.
Yeah, got you. Okay, good. Well, please give out your website and just wrap it up with any final thoughts, anything I didn't ask you, whatever else you want to share before you go, and a website. Of course, the books are available in all the usual places. And you've got, 25 books? Was that the correct number?
That's more or less correct. Yeah.
Wow. That's amazing. Yeah. So wrap it up for us, if you would.
Let me put it this way. This is the project that took me about 50 years of studying history to come to. Okay. Historians like myself, we start off looking at very small things, a process of change in a limited time in a small place. And then through our years, we learn more and more, and we come to, to broader generalization. So this is the culmination of 50 years work of looking at the changing nature of empires, the kind of world orders they create, and then also trying to take that past and project it into the future. You challenge some of my conclusions. But let me put it this way. Supposing these projections about climate change are wrong, right? And that maybe it was overstated, or maybe there is some technology in the germ that's going to mitigate it. But if we take the serious steps of transforming the grid to renewable energy and transforming our transport to renewable energy and revitalizing nuclear energy and all of that, okay? What's the damage? We've accomplished a great transformation of our economy. We have a more sustainable form of energy that could last for another century or two. So it strikes me as it's worth doing, even if climate change is wrong or overstated.
Right. Yeah, fair enough. I agree. Do you have a website to share?
No, I don't, but you can find my book on Amazon.com.
Good stuff. Well, Alfred McCoy, thank you so much for joining us and sharing all of these ideas and views of the future with us. The only way we can know how to deal with things is to anticipate things, whether they be positive or negative, and just prepare as best we can. So we appreciate you being with us. Thank you.
And Jason, thanks for the conversation. These are some interesting kinds of questions. I don't usually get them.
My pleasure.
All right, thank you.